Hey there everyone, Afrodo Reviews here, bringing you another book to decide. Is it worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? So let's decide. Today's book, coming from deep within a time where our nation was at war with itself, brother fighting brother, and supernatural evil preying upon the weak and defenseless, and a butler who was assigned to stop it all. Oh my god. This really is a damned nation, isn't it? Damnation is a book written by Nick Pollotta, or Pollotta. I think it's Pollotta when I was looking at the word the other day, just based on what it is, so I'm going to call it Pollotta from now on. But Damnation is a book from Nick Pollotta that was released on September 15th, 2005 by Double Dragon Publishing. Although from what I could tell, it was picked up by a different publishing company afterwards. I'm not sure if I have that mixed up or not. There's very little on books like this when it comes to the publication history, effectively. From what I could find, though, it's actually part of a series known as Bureau 13. And this is actually the fourth book in its... Let me take that out real quick. This is actually the fourth book in its run, and is actually a prequel to the starting of the Bureau. From what I can tell, the Bureau 13 is sort of like every government agency hunting the supernatural.
Welcome to Warehouse 13.
What is this place?
I like to think of it as America's attic.
I don't know if the other books are any different from this or not, but I'm just putting that out there. Now, obviously that leaves me a bit out of the loop knowing that this is a prequel, but I stand by the belief that if you write a prequel, someone who's never read any of the books that came before it should be able to read the prequel without needing to read that and understand what's going on. You are telling a story before that, and that story should stand on its own and not rely on constant call forwards, I guess. The general ratings on this book that I could find are generally good, although very, very minimal compared to a lot of the other stuff I've reviewed on this channel. That out of the way, nothing else more to talk about in terms of background. We'll move on and start where we always do. The cover. The cover for Damnation is okay. It's not great, but I do like it to an extent. It's basically you got a clawed hand, from what I can only assume is meant to be the main creature antagonist of this book, which is something called a drow. But a long clawed hand reaching up out of the ground. The background is supposed to be a battlefield, but has been covered in so much dust and the fog of war that you can't see anything in it, so that's me speculating. In the background you have two flags. One is the Confederate flag, and one is the U.S. flag, because it takes place during Civil War. Like I said, it's pretty good. Not good, it's okay. I mean, it doesn't get me terribly excited, but it does catch my attention. And that's what a book should do, what a cover should do. It mostly deals with what's going on, not terribly, but it does. The back, however, is bland. It's just a black background. The publishing company is front and center on the back, with a synopsis underneath it and 3 reviews to hype up the book. Although only one's from a book review company and the others are from 2 science fiction fantasy magazines. So all in all, the cover's okay. It does its job. I think maybe there's a couple of things they could have done to make it a little better. Like, maybe, reduce the dust here, the fog of war, and, show some of the battle of the Civil War in the background. Something like that. But otherwise, it's fine. That's what I gotta say about it. However, to do something I don't normally do, when I look at the more modern cover of the book, at least the one that always pops up when I look this book up online, I don't like that one as much. Now, don't get me wrong. I can appreciate the specific allure they're trying to appeal to in this art, but this is just this looks like a pinup picture that says nothing about the book that you're saying. You're nothing about the book. This literally could exist anywhere. Maybe the Civil War outfit the girl's wearing is somewhat indicative, but again, it's just a pinup picture. There's nothing about this cover that tells me anything about this book. I mean, there's not even really a strong female protagonist. So yeah, this cover is definitely better than that cover. Just putting that out there. On to the story itself. Now, for those of you who read my TBR, you know that I read the synopsis out loud, so to get you a basic understanding of the book. However, and while I will link this up there, like I normally do, I'm going to be honest with you guys and say that the synopsis is actually not very good for this. And I will still recommend checking out the TBR because me want views. But for this book, synopsis is kind of it's sort of one of those misleading ones. One of the ones that talk about the book in a different way than the book actually goes. Basically, the book follows John Sanders, a recently appointed U.S. Marshal who, following an assassination attempt on President Lincoln by a werewolf, or shape changer technically, shapeshifter by the book's rules. I get to do the Twilight thing, yeah, that's smart. In fairness, I'm pretty sure this came out before Twilight, so that's just me being facetious. But after following an assassination attempt on President Lincoln, the executive mansion butler is appointed as a U.S. Marshal and sent out to investigate the supernatural attempt. However, this also ties into a small plot that was happening in the background, where people were believing that the Confederates were using poison bullets on their soldiers, because soldiers were showing up on the battlefield barely wounded, but contorted and twisted in painful ways. And it soon reveals that, no, that's also part of this, too. However, it very much is a backdrop. Despite the big emphasis that the back of this book places on it, the whole something feasting on injured men on the battlefield is a very minor subplot on the book. You could remove most of the mentions of it, and this book would mostly work the same. Like, legitimately, completely the same. So, I'm just going to put that out there before I go too deep into this. What I did like about this story, it's actually very interesting to read. It keeps up a nice, fast pace, and, you know, it constantly feels like it's moving. There's never really a point where I got bored reading it. I will admit that that doesn't always help it to kind of give a backhanded compliment, I guess. In the sense that sometimes it feels like it's going so fast, it's threatening to give you whiplash. But for the most part, this fast-paced helps the story. The character John Sanders is actually a pretty decent one, too. Admittedly, he teetered very closely to being a Mary Sue, especially in the early chapters. But I think there was just enough pulled back that he doesn't quite fully go Mary Sue. However, at the same time, he's a very interesting character to read, and, you know, he's not bland, I guess is a good way of putting it. With some of the supporting characters also being pretty decent for it, too. To move on, unfortunately, I have to move on to more of what I didn't like about this book. And that's, it's going to be a bigger list. I'm going to explain why. To put a quick point on it, this book suffers from what I call death by 1,000 cuts. Or death by 1,000 nitpicks, I guess is a better word for it. It's in the sense that there's no real big, gigantic thing that's wrong with it. There's no one general issue that permeates the entire book that I'm like, yeah, if it didn't have this book would be 10 times better, etc. No, and in fact, I think a lot of what's wrong with this book is a lot of small stuff that just kept piling up and up and up until eventually it's the straw that broke the camel's back. And it's just, there's just so many small things that you might be able to ignore if it was, you know, even there's only like 10 of them, but there's a lot of them. I would honestly need to dedicate an entire video to going over every single nitpick I had with this book. So I'm going to go over the more basic ones, the bigger ones that permeated more throughout the book than necessarily in one or two small sections. If you guys really want me to go through and comment on every nitpick I had, I'll upload a follow-up video to this, but for now, I'm not going to do that. But yeah, this ranges from tiny things, from like things that don't make sense in context. Like the main character, John, sitting there speculating that maybe the rabies, because of the symptoms that it provides and how well it syncs up with various legends of werewolves and vampires, that maybe rabies was actually the reason that the supernatural myths of werewolves and vampires are so prominent throughout the world. in a world where he knows werewolves and vampires are real. But there's also the more objective and minor points, like formatting and typos. Now, normally with books like this, where it's, more looks like a self-published work, I tend to be more forgiving on that, because no matter how often you go through it, you're always going to miss something. And so I try not to be too harsh on it. However, this was picked up by a publishing company, and there are mistakes in here that even if the author had gone through, he should have picked up. So I'm going to comment on them. There's one paragraph here at the start of chapter 19 where, out of nowhere, a single paragraph of the book is in a completely different font from the rest of the book. And this is notable because there's no reason for it. It's just a description of the scene around them. And it's not like, you're in the mind of something much different than a human or anything like that, would make sense. It's just a typo. He accidentally made this a different font and didn't notice. But there's also formatting issues where occasionally a sentence will be like double spaced, or an underscore will place a space in several scenes, double periods, a word that's spelled wrong. There's a lot of those in here. And like I said, it's one of those, I'm normally more forgiving, but because this was picked up by a publishing company and because these are really blatant typos, I am mentioning here as an issue. Honestly, my favorite nitpick of this book, though, it's one of the ones that makes me laugh more than it annoys me, but my favorite nitpick of this book is the Drell. Like how I mentioned, this is supposed to be a Drell arm, the creature that's the center face of the supernatural threat. The Drell, there's a lot of build up to a Drell's face, how it looks so horrible, how every character who's seen it screams in terror, or the ones who do survive talk about how it's just so bad they don't even want to remember it anymore. So they push it off and go away. And when we finally do get a description of the Drell's face, it is described as, and I quote, a toothy anus, which I don't need to say, while it made me laugh, that is not the payoff you want to give for something you built up for several chapters. Unfortunately, unless we're in a very, very weird side of the internet, toothy anus is not a good payoff for a build-up. Onto the more major overarching points that get off these smaller nitpicks. The first that comes to mind, most obviously, is this book is very anachronistic. Now, for those of you who don't know what that means this book is written in one time period, or in general, it means something's in one time period, but it at least feels like it belongs in another time period.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet.
When I say this book is anachronistic, I mean that there's a sense that this book you can change very little, and this book could be set in modern day. Like, one of the things that I was really interested in when it came to this was seeing how John dealt with the supernatural in a day where Civil War weapons technology is what it is. He would have guns, but they'd be very inaccurate, and they wouldn't have very large range, and he would have to take a long time reloading them if they want a pistol. So you would think that he has to approach these situations more cleverly and, without the gun-ho attitude that you would see in more modern stuff of people who are just starting to hunt supernatural. No. He pretty much shoots his way out of almost every issue, to the point I'm left thinking, I think he's using too much ammo. Like, I'm pretty sure these guns don't have that much ammo, as it's described as him, basically. So yeah, it's just one of those, there's way too much bang, 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 bang. Another issue is, I thought about, it'd be interesting to see how he learns about the supernatural and stuff in a world where the information sharing isn't nearly as high as it is, and he would have to dig out specific things talking about this. And no, after a visit to a Catholic priest and a rabbi, he pretty much has a massive rundown of every supernatural thing that exists. That's not me joking. That's pretty much it. To get a little more political on this next one, and with the focus of the time period that it's set in, one of the things about this book that made me uncomfortable reading it was it feels like it's glorifying the South to put a quick disclaimer on this, I don't feel like Pollotta ever really came out and basically said the South was on the right side of the war, or the South was right. However, there's a lot of smaller, subtle things that the more the book went on, the more I noticed, and the more I thought, is that what he thinks? It's the small things, like how the two sides are presented with the initial werewolf assassination, because both Davis and Lincoln are attacked by a werewolf assassin, effectively. Again, shapeshifter assassin, but I'm just going to call them werewolves, because the book calls them werewolves even after revealing the shapeshifters. One of the things is, when they attack Lincoln, they are fighting this thing for like several minutes. They're just pumping lead into it because they can't think of any other solution. And it takes an outside observer, i.e. John, to notice that when President Lincoln managed to punch the werewolf in the face, the silver ring he had on caused a small cut, which wasn't healing like all the gunshots and bullet wounds. So that's what led to them learning the weakness of silver for the werewolf. On the other hand, when the werewolf attacks Davis instantly knows what it is, gets his silver saber out, and they kill that thing fast. Like, they knew instantly what to do. But then you have other small things, like Davis's wife, her name's escaping my mind, being introduced as a very kind, innocent woman who's introduced reading to a group of children gathered all around her, turning and smiling at our point of view character as he enters, showing that even though she's the first lady, she doesn't see herself as above the common rabble soldiers. Then we get Mary Todd Lincoln, who everyone is constantly referring to as kind of a screeching harpy, who even in the middle of wartime is super focused on redecorating and keeping the executive mansion completely in order. And when John and her have an interaction where he's a marshal and John reminds her, hey, I'm a marshal now, I would like you to call me Marshal John instead of Butler or anything like that, she's very clearly displeased that she has to see him as an equal now. Or even things like how the generals are portrayed. All the Southern generals are portrayed as calm, collected, men's men who know how to think things through and are quick on the uptake, quick to agree, versus the Union generals, who, while they aren't portrayed badly, one pukes his guts out after the werewolf assassination attempt for like several minutes. Another is an extremely petty asshat who really does not like that John was promoted to marshal over one of his soldiers and throws a fit the entire time, despite actually making valid points. And there's repeated references to how Ulysses S. Grant is such a drunkard that, he can barely stand up straight.
Ulysses S. Grant, you invite me to lunch, then show up an hour late, drunk?
I was busy looking for your wife to give her the old...
And another small thing. Every time someone mentions the war is about slavery, a smart character will immediately either correct them or comment, or mention that he wants to comment, i.e. our main character John. The war is not really about slavery, it's about states' rights, you know that? And just for the record, yes, that is true. A state's right to slavery. As I want to be clear, as I say with all these things when I bring them up, I am not accusing Nick Pollotta of this, of being racist or siding with the South or anything. I'm just bringing up how it comes off as I read. Finally, the one thing I want to comment on is this book has a lot of padding. And this padding it's just one of those, there's a lot of moments in this book where it just feels like he wrote this section in because he didn't have enough to reach a certain page limit that he wanted. For example, one such thing is, like, for a while we were getting at the start of chapters, we were getting brief moments where we would cut to a completely different POV than John to see what's going on. Now, while some of these work, like the assassination attempt on Davis, or revealing John's counterpart in the South, the Hammer, and what he's currently doing, most of them just feel like padding. Like, there's one where Doctor is collecting the bullets from wounded Union soldiers to determine if that poison bullet theory is legitimate. And while that could be interesting to create a sense of dramatic irony, as this doctor encounters and is killed by a Drell, that's not really needed, because it's not like 2 or 3 chapters later that John, without even coming to the battlefield, is able to determine that the Drells are behind the poison bullet conspiracy, and he does so without that doctor or anything else. There's another issue, there's another one, like when John is ambushed and captured by a group of highwaymen, basically, who are robbing him of all of his stuff, even down to his shoes. And you think, okay, so this is to quickly disarm him, to create some tension, delay him getting back to the executive mansion so that he misses an important event by that much. No. John gets free, kills the thieves, gets all his stuff back, and makes it back perfectly fine. In fact, he gets a promotion for the day of work he's done as a U.S. Marshal to U.S. Special Agent. So, again, that's kind of what I meant when I said John comes really close to being a Mary Sue, is he's very well liked by almost everyone. Anyone who doesn't like him is portrayed as in the wrong. You know what? I'm getting caught up on the point. To go back to my padding point, there's also a constable named Harry Trencham, one of that, where we spend a few chapters getting to know him. So John decides, hey, I'm going to deputize you so you can help me. You think leading to a nice buddy cop dynamic, and no, he dies the next chapter once his use is outlived. Really, there's just a lot of padding. There's a lot of scenes in here that you could cut off and the story would not be any lesser for it. It would be shorter, but not lesser. And that's part of the issue when I say there's a lot of padding. One final point that I probably should have cut off. I should cut off or not. One final point that it was probably somewhat obvious from the rating card where I do the test now. The women in this are not portrayed greatly. Pretty much every woman in this book is sexualized in some way, or is in some way referring to sex, or is in some way in a relationship with someone else that John knows. There's no woman in here that's not in some way sexualized, and that's very noticeable, and it's annoying. In the end, I'd probably give this book a 6 out of 10. So overall, it's definitely not a bad book. Unlike last week's Lord of the Dead, it's at least fast-paced, and it moves as it goes, whereas Lord of the Dead just felt like a chore to read, where it was just slow. And while this kind of goes in the opposite direction a little too much, it's still entertaining enough, and there are a few scenes in here where even the humor, as anachronistic as it is, did make me smile or chuckle, and the characters, well, like I said, the characters are perfectly fine for the most part. There's nothing, unlike Lord of the Dead, where I didn't really sympathize with Byron very much. I did also like most of the characters in here, as close as they got to Mary Sudom or anything else. That being said, the book really does suffer from Death from a Thousand Cuts. And the reason I rated it a 6 out of 10 as opposed to lower is because I recognize that a lot of these points that I made probably aren't going to be as big of a deal for many other people. For me, it's perfectly fine and I can ignore it. But for me, there's only so many small cuts a book can have before it basically bleeds out. I don't think it quite deserves Mount Doom, but I will say that it got close enough that it was singeing off its arm hairs. If you want a recommendation based on this book, I guess if you're looking for the story of a butler who is turned... a comedic tale of a butler being turned into a hunter of the supernatural during the Civil War after a werewolf attempts to kill President Lincoln, this is your story. Or if you're already invested in the Bureau 13 series, probably that. But other than that, I guess I wouldn't know how to recommend it to you. Now, for those of you who watch my TBR, you know that when it came to the final book of this month, I didn't really give you guys a clear idea what I was going to do. That was on purpose. Bye.